It's our great pleasure this evening to welcome Marion Molteno to this evening's event. Marion is an award-winning author, and the purpose of this gathering is for us to have an opportunity to hear from her about both her journey as a writer and her journeys as an individual who has spent much of her life supporting refugees and people on the move. Marion was born in South Africa, but had to leave due to opposition to the apartheid regime. After spending a few years in Zambia, she then moved to London, where she has lived since 1977. Marion taught English classes for adults and set up a community project. And among those learning English were asylum seekers and displaced people. And so she set up a support organization to help them to adjust to life in the UK. Marion also worked for Save the Children International as one of their policy advisors. And in this capacity, Marion traveled across Asia and Africa. She has described this as a life-changing experience. Marion has published a number of books, and most recently, Journeys Without a Map is one that we will be talking about this evening. I've got my copy, which is great. And we're very grateful to Marion for giving up her time to come and speak to us this evening. The discussion is going to be chaired by Harry Angel. Harry is a writer and has published books about Pilates. She's also a yoga teacher and a big supporter of Marlow Refugee Action. On Sunday, she completed the virtual London Marathon for us, raising nearly £1,500. So many thanks and congratulations to Harry. I'm going to stop talking now and pass over to you, Harry. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tanya. Well, I'm delighted to be here asking you lots of questions, Marion. I've
privileged to be here. Thank you.
I've loved reading Journeys Without a Map, which I've now finished, and it's a beautiful, beautiful book. So I'm going to start by asking you questions about that book and your writing process and career before we get on to other things, because as a writer, I'm very interested in that, and I hope others are too. So what I'd like to know is if you can tell us a little bit more about your memoir, but it's a memoir, not a novel, and why you decided to write it instead of another novel. Because I can't believe you haven't got millions of other stories waiting to be told. So just possibly give some background. Carry on. Yeah.
I think I've got more real stories than novels pushing to come out at the moment, actually. I think that was the starting point. When I published my last novel, which is this one, it's called Uncertain Light. By the way, it looks enormous. It is rather enormous, but it's not very long. It's got a nice big typeface inside, so it reads, I'm told, quite quickly. I don't know if anybody here has tried to read it, but I haven't heard people say it's too long, I couldn't finish it. So that book was a real magnum opus. That came out of my experience of working in Save the Children, which I did for 13 years. And as Tanya said in her introduction, it was totally a life-changing experience. It was a lot of traveling, but really what changed my life was meeting all those people, absolutely extraordinary people of all kinds, people who were international in the sense that many of them came from Britain or America or Canada or Europe, but they moved to other countries to do humanitarian work, but mostly local people. The vast majority were local in their own country and responding to the needs of people that they saw around them. And there was this wonderful combination of local experience and international knowledge, so that hopefully one could support people not to reinvent the wheel, but if a good idea had been tried somewhere in one situation, if there was a similar situation in another country, it could be tried there. But I was completely, I was ignorant everywhere I went, and I found every experience totally educational and as a human being, utterly moving. I never wanted to go because I was quite nervous of all the traveling, and I didn't want to leave my home and face yet another new situation. But once I was there, I never wanted to come back. It was so evolving. And I knew when I started on those journeys, I knew that as a novelist, this was going to come out in a novel sometime. It was just such a huge set of experiences. But because it was so huge, I actually couldn't do it. So during the time I was at Save the Children, I wrote another novel, which has nothing to do with it at all, which was my kind of escapist novel, which is this one. It's called Somewhere More Simple. It's set on the Isles of Scilly, which is a tiny environment. You couldn't have anything more different from this vast world scale that I was trying to operate on. But when I'd finished at Save the Children, I knew all of these experiences would somehow needed to surface. But actually, of course, what was motivating me was real experiences. I had to find a format, a fictional format to put it in so that I wasn't exposing people's real lives. But also, the thing about fiction that's rather wonderful is you can distill the essence of something and invent people to carry that essence. So the actual story is not true. The story never happened, but it's true to life in the sense that it's the distillation of lots and lots of people's life experiences. And that was a major project. It took me many years and several attempts, and then gave it up and then came back to it again. And in the end, I am happy with it. I do think, no book completely fulfills the purpose that you want it to, but I got near enough that I feel it does communicate. But once that was published, I'm an author that people who read my books like them on the whole. I've got very loyal readers, but I'm not a well-known author in the sense I don't have a big publisher behind me. The bookshops don't carry my books because they don't think anybody will know who I am and they won't pick them up. So it's a big struggle to launch a book once it's written, once it's published. You've got to tell people about it. I'm having the opportunity tonight to tell you about my new book, which is very lucky for me. But in the process of trying to tell people about this book, my big novel, I had retired and I just made myself available to talk to groups wherever I could possibly receive an invitation. And I didn't know whether that would work. I didn't know whether anybody would have me. I didn't know whether I would be doing it just in 2 places or in several. And I had no idea what was going to happen, but I've been really hopeless at keeping diaries through my life because I'm usually writing a book. But I decided this time I was going to do the equivalent of a diary, but I decided to do it as a blog. So when I'd been to a place, I'd write a little blog post about some aspect of it. And then just before lockdown, actually, I was sitting with the young woman who very kindly set up a website for me. And we're looking at it and I needed to update it. And I said, I don't know what to do with all these blog posts. I mean, it was a whole chunk of my life, but I don't want to just throw them away, but they're all out of date now. She said, well, why don't you just put them together and put them as a sort of an archive thing on your website? So I said, okay, I'll just have a look at them, see if I want to change the order, and I'll send it to you next week. Well, it was 6 months because I realized when I was looking at them that actually this was a story. It happened to be a true story of a writer trying to tell people about her work. And why would I be telling them about my work? Because I actually thought the content was important. It's not because I think I'm a brilliant novelist, but because I've got something to share. And something is hugely about refugees, displaced people, people living in poverty, people of good heart trying to do something about it. So it's very strongly connected to the thing that motivates you to be working in the refugee action group. So it didn't feel like I was pushing myself. It felt like I was pushing the cause, if you like. But in the process, I had to learn to push myself. I had to learn to say, here's a book, I think you might enjoy reading it, which is kind of hard to do, but I got over that quite quickly, actually. I did discover that people were interested in knowing about me behind the book. And that wasn't what I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk about the issues. But yes, they wanted to know, how did you start writing this? Why did you start writing this book? So I actually realized that there was a journey in my life too. There'd been all these little journeys I'd be making telling other people, but actually my life had been a journey. I didn't set out to be a novelist at all. And I became one. I never called myself a novelist until I'd stopped earning my living at something. I've never earned much money from my books, but I've had to earn my living in some way. And if people say, what do you do? I'd say, oh, I work for Save the Children. I never said I'm a writer. But I actually began to realize once I'd retired, I am a writer. People like my books, they read them. Why am I hiding? So I kind of came of age as a writer in the process of trying to record for myself what my journey had been as a writer. And that's this book. It's my journey of becoming a writer, but told in backflashes through the current journey of trying to tell people about the issues behind my books.
And it's excellent because when I was reading Uncertain Light, there were certain questions that came up about Rahul, for instance, and whether you knew him and whether you'd come across him in real life and how you developed him. And of course, you answer those questions in this book, which is great. In fact, you answered a lot of questions that I had in this book. But something else, I mean, as a writer myself who can't get my novel placed, just one little thing which I was incredibly impressed with, the route you took when you first got published. Maybe you could tell us about the process you took and the fictional publishers you created.
Well, they weren't fictional in the sense they did actually publish a book, but they were fictional in the sense that they weren't big publishers publishing lots of books. So I was very, very lucky with my first book. I actually got it published. That's this one. It's A Language in Common. This is the original cover. If some of you have seen it, you might have seen it with the new cover, the new edition. But the Women's Press did this in the middle of the 1980s. And the reason that they took it was that it grew out of my work teaching English to women who'd come from India and Pakistan and Bangladesh to live in Britain. And at that point, there were no South Asian fiction writers. You know, they came afterwards, not very long afterwards, but at that point, it was like a whole group of people had not had a voice. And precisely because they were having to learn English as a second language, there wasn't a production of people who could write about their own experiences, either in autobiography or in fiction or whatever. So I think the Women's Press saw this as giving a voice to a whole group of women. I had no idea how lucky I was. I just thought, well, that's really nice. I must have written quite a good book. I got it published. And after that, it didn't go downhill. It started at rock bottom after that. I found it completely impossible to find a publisher, which kind of, I have to admit, surprised me, because I thought if I'd had one book published and it had done quite well, that would be okay. But I was working full time and I had children, and a book takes me 7 years. And by the end of 7 years, none of the people who reviewed the last book are there. None of the people who work in the bookshops are there. None of the people who accept books in publishers are there. They all moved on to other things. So you're starting from scratch. Mm. And this was the book I wrote. And this one, if you know, for people who want to confront the asylum issues in this country head on, this is the novel. This is my refugee book. It's about people who've come to live in Britain and are seeking asylum. And it's not so much about why they came, although that is there in the background, but it's mostly that once you're here, it doesn't matter where you came from. If you're seeking asylum, you're all thrown into the same really, really difficult process that you've got to negotiate. So it's kind of like being caught in that process. I thought it was a topical issue. It was a topical issue. It's unfortunately always topical. It hasn't stopped being topical, but it was somehow beyond what mainstream publishers thought they could interest an audience in. And it was set among Somali refugees. This was 1990, and this war in Somalia just broke out. Nowadays, everybody knows where Somalia is. It's been in the news for decades. In those days, they didn't. And I think the publishers thought this is a step too far. Anyway, I was buoyed up by the reactions of my friends who'd read my short stories, who were basically very indignant. They read drafts of the book. They said, "It's great. This is absolutely ridiculous." And one of my very special friends was my mentor, who was old enough to be my father, and he played a big role in encouraging me to write. And he basically lent me the money. Said, "Just do it yourself." And that came out of his experience. He was a translator of Urdu literature for English readers. And there's not very many English readers, mainstream readers, who read translations of Urdu literature or know anything about it. So he was very used to the fact that his life work wasn't going to command a large audience, and he'd be very lucky if he got a publisher. And he thought it didn't matter at all. What mattered was write it, and then if you can find somebody who actually published it, it's there, it exists, and somebody can find it later. And I found that a really helpful philosophy. So basically, my husband is a publisher, the books on the shelf behind are his, not mine. But he publishes strictly non-fiction about development issues, and there was no way that he was going to. I mean, absolutely no. Even if he'd been a fiction publisher, there's no way he was going to publish my book. But he could tell me, he could give me an introduction to a cover designer and a printer and a this and a that, and so I basically project managed it. I sent off the draft to somebody who did the copy editing, and then we sent off the draft to cover it. And it just, that's all it is actually. That's all publishing is you need the help of certain specialists, and somebody has to project manage it, and somebody has to put up the money to pay them, and then you send it to a printer, and then boxes of books arrive in your front room, and that's when the trouble starts.
And then you've got to do all the marketing, of which you've
got to
been
get rid of them. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, but yeah, all the stories appear in Journeys Without a Map. So all the marketing you did, all the literary events that you went to, from New Zealand to I don't know where, everywhere, where 4 people turned up and 400 people turned up. And
it was very often on the end of the spectrum of 4. I was extremely lucky to get 1 or 2 big ones, and the luck came with my second book, my second novel, which is called If You Can Walk, You Can Dance, which again, I really was, every mother thinks that her child is beautiful. Every writer of a book is convinced that this is the book everybody wants to read. I mean, you wouldn't really risk putting it in front of people if you didn't think it was pretty good. You soon realize it's probably not the only good book in the world, but there's that euphoric moment when you really think it is. And in that state, I sent it off to publishers. I was absolutely, oh, well, they're not going to do it again. Well, I do know how to do it, so I'll do it myself again. So I did it myself, and blow me, it won a prize. And I was then dead embarrassed because I had to admit that I published it myself. And I assumed they would then disqualify it, but they didn't. They took me on. And that was the Commonwealth Writers' Prize, and it was awarded in New Zealand that year. So I kind of suddenly entered the company of real writers by going to a real literary festival and getting a prize for my book, which was very exciting.
And you, as I say, you tell the stories in Journeys Without a Map, and some of them are very, very amusing. Something else I'd like to just bring in now, because poetry has featured a lot in your life and in your writing, hasn't it? As has music. And you write that poetry moves across cultures, which you demonstrate beautifully in an uncertain light. But you had an Urdu teacher, Ralph Russell, who was a friend and a very important person in your life. So his story is very interesting, and your story about what persuaded you to learn and later translate Urdu is also very interesting. Perhaps you'd like to sort of tell us a bit about that.
Well, I think, yes, I think it was an incredible stroke of luck that I was taught by him. He was head of Urdu teaching at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies, for 30 years. And I think Anne Barker, Michael's wife, I think she studied at SOAS. Her path and mine were quite similar at that point, is by meeting people who'd come from India and Pakistan in English classes, got interested in, she was teaching her language and got interested in learning their language. And that was my motivation as well. I wanted to put the teaching and the learning on an equal footing, a cultural exchange, rather than, here we are the dominant culture and you're trying to enter it by learning a bit of our language. So I started learning first Hindi actually, and then I was struggling. I got to a certain point, but I was struggling. And then I met Ralph. We were teaching. I asked him to help teach on a teacher training course that I was running. And I saw immediately that this guy is just one of life's natural teachers. He had an absolutely instinctive way of adjusting the level of what he was doing, what he was teaching, to the level that was appropriate for that person. He had no idea how he did it. He didn't realize it was a special gift, but it really was. And as a language teacher, I was just absolutely fascinated at his style of teaching language. He also had an instinctive ability to simplify the grammar of the language into logical steps, so that if you just went through his course book step by step, you actually got fluent. Quite extraordinary. And so I was just just bowled over by the fact that he took me on as a student and learning. And then in the course of these lessons, the phone would ring and he'd be speaking. He was an Englishman, but he'd been sent to India in the war as a conscript. And so he learned Urdu there. And he took it seriously, which very few English young officers did. And he became completely fluent. So that such that Urdu speakers told me that if you were speaking to him on the phone, you would have imagined you were speaking to a native speaker. Only when you saw him, you realized he was a white man, he wasn't an Indian or a Pakistani, but he was completely, and he got completely fluent by dedicating his life to continually learning in a very impressive way. Anyway, so he'd be speaking to somebody on the phone, and then, you could hear he was quoting poetry, because poetry has a meter and often a rhyme as well. And I began to realize these guys quote poetry at each other the whole time, basically. And then I started asking him about it, and he started telling me, and pull out, and he'd say something about a particular poet, and he'd say, well, I wrote an article about that, and he'd pull it out, and I'd read that, and so on. So I had no idea the poetry was there. I had no such a strong aspect of Urdu culture. I had no idea of learning anything about it, but because he was offering it, and it was such a rich, interesting thing, I kind of followed in his footsteps. I'm not a translator. He was an outstanding translator, and my Urdu is not nearly good enough to be able to do that initially, but it's good enough to be able to see how good his translations are. And I helped him. He was, as I said, old enough to be my father. He'd written all these academic articles all his life, but not very many books. And I persuaded him all these articles ought to be put together in books. So I edited his books, and they were published in India and Pakistan. And he read drafts of what I was writing. So we were kind of writing colleagues in that way. The poetry that Harry was asking about comes mostly in this book, Uncertain Light. There's a central character who grows up in that tradition of Urdu poetry. And so like Ralph and his friends, he's got a quotation for every occasion of the poetry. And the poetry very conveniently comes in couplets. The commonest form of the poetry is a series of couplets, each of which is independent in meaning. So it really lends itself to short quotations about anything. So the way people will quote something from Shakespeare in our culture, but far, far more, they quote things from poetry. So when I was writing Uncertain Light, the central character came into my mind who had grown up with that, was very bicultural, was operating as a humanitarian worker internationally, but that was his personal culture. So I used Ralph's translations of Urdu poetry in the book. And sadly, he died before it came out.
Oh, that's a shame.
He knew I was doing it, and he helped me a lot in thinking about it.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Well, the poetry in An Uncertain Light is very moving. I really enjoyed reading it. I think it's great. But An Uncertain Light is also, as well as giving an insight into war conditions that cause people to flee, and it's also a love story and a story about grief, isn't it?
Mm.
Between Tessa and Rahul. I mean, how did that come about?
Well, I think there's grief in life, isn't there? There's no life without grief. If anybody, there's no life without love. As soon as you love somebody, you make yourself vulnerable to losing them. The more you love someone, the bigger your loss when they go. And in the last couple of years, we've all lived with loss, or knowing people who've had big losses. And I mean, that's part of normal life, but perhaps we've heard a bit more about it in recent years because of the pandemic. When you think about refugees, they're all dealing with loss in a huge way. They've lost their place, their familiarity, their role in society, but they've all lost people close to them, and often traumatically. So, the concerns of my life as a worker with refugees and in Save the Children, with people in very, very hard situations, life situations, you see a lot of but you also see you all the time grief is being dealt with. And I think for me, the question is, I didn't want to write a book about grief. I wanted to write a book about life, but life involves how you deal with loss. So the central relationship is one in which basically somebody very close to you has been lost.
Yeah. So do you plot your novels, or is it the people you've said before? Is it the people you meet that then?
And I'm a very poor plotter. I think I would, in terms of the economics, economically using one's time, it would be so nice to be able to work out the story beforehand and then write to that. I absolutely can't do that. And I think I was saying that to somebody once, and he said, well, don't ever try, because your strength lies elsewhere. And I think my strength lies in the fact that I'm very interested in people, and I watch people a lot, and I listen to people a lot. And I never meet anybody I'm not interested in, even if they're very, very different from me. That's interesting in itself. How does somebody feel when they're so different, or how do they get there? And I'm terribly interested in people's life histories, how they got to be where they are now from where they started. So I realized when I was, early on in my time in English, it's quite it's not a very English thing to start asking people very personal questions very soon after you meet them. And I tend to do that. And actually my mentor, Ralph, who was English totally, was a master at it. He's just gave you the Inquisition when he met you. And you had to be pretty dim not to realize that it was because he was terribly interested in people. He really wanted to know them. So people didn't take offense, but they would laugh about the fact that, it was the third degree. And I'm a little bit like that myself. I have learned not to do it straight away when I meet somebody, but I get there quite quickly. And so my head is full of everybody else's lives. And so my stories start with choosing characters in a particular setting, a particular historical or geographic setting, or a moment in history. This is happening and these people are caught up in it. And once you've clarified in your mind who the people are, then it's kind of like setting them off moving, and then you don't have much choice about the plot, because if you really know somebody well, there's only one way they're going to react to something.
Well, I think that's wonderful. I think curiosity is a great thing, especially about people. So what's next? What are you writing next?
Well, the thing that's queuing up is my parents. I would really like to share them before I die.
Oh.
There's this thing about how long do we live after we've died, and depending on your religious belief or lack of it, you answer the question differently. I don't have a belief in any afterlife at all. For me, people live as long as they are remembered by somebody, as long as they're important to somebody. And so, I never knew any of my grandparents. They'd all died before I was born, but they were big people in the lives of my parents. Actually, my mother never knew her mother. She died when she was very little. My father never knew his father. He died when he was very little. But from aunts and uncles and everybody else, they had very strong pictures of these people. And I have very strong pictures of them. So I reckon I go back to my grandparents and my great-grandparents to a lesser extent. And I've got all those stories in my head. My daughters don't have any of those stories, because we changed countries. They saw very little of the grandparents who were alive when they were children. My grandchildren obviously don't know the first thing, and they don't know anything about my life really, or my husband's life, or their other grandparents' lives, because you speak to children about what's going on in their lives at that time. And in the last sort of 5-10 years or so, I think I've just become very aware of how lucky I am to have my parents in my psyche. They were very, very special people to me, and I think they were special people to quite a lot of people. They weren't famous, they weren't important in any external way, but I just felt I never gave them to my children enough, and I can't give them to my grandchildren, and I don't actually want them to disappear. And I've got I had 3 brothers, one died quite young. I've got 2 brothers. We're all in our late 70s. Well, the oldest of them is 82. Who knows how long we'll last? My mother was gone when she was 85. My father was gone when he was 72. I'm living on borrowed time, and I would like to share them.
Well, I certainly will look forward to reading that, as well as I think it's a great thing that that your family and your grandchildren particularly will be able to read and know their past. And you mentioned your mother in Journeys Without a Map, and the one thing that stood out for me was that she used to put quotations inside her wardrobe for you to read.
Yes.
I think that's wonderful.
Yes.
Wonderful. She was obviously a great influence.
She didn't put them there for me to read. She put them there for herself. Yes, she was reminding herself of things, you know. And the one, I don't think this one comes into Journeys Without a Map, but the one that really struck me was this very well-known prayer about Lord, grant me the serenity to accept the things I can't change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And, you know, basically that sums it all. That's the challenge of life. I mean, you don't have to say any more than that, but it used to really interest me as a child. Which one of those did my mother think she lacked?
Oh, wow.
She clearly was telling herself something that she had to keep remembering.
Well, on that note, I think, and thank you for answering all my questions. I've got about 3,000 more, but anyway, we'll move on. Has anyone got any questions they'd like to ask Marion now? And I will mute myself.
So we're all unmuting now.
We can all unmute, yes. I'm going to jump right in, actually, if I may. I guess I'm thinking that it's a huge responsibility. It's a great privilege, and it's a huge responsibility to carry other people's stories and tell other people's stories. And I just wonder, Marion, of all the people that you've met, and obviously thinking particularly about people who are refugees and displaced, how they have felt about your work.
Well, the truth is that very few of them read, all the people that I've been working with teaching English, and all the asylum seekers, and all the people almost all the people living in other countries that I've worked with Save the Children, almost none of them read novels in English. So, you know, it's not something that, those that are competent in English may read other things in English. They don't necessarily read novels. But I have tempted one or two of them too, because I really wanted them to feel there was an honest reflection of them coming through. But all my characters are fictionalized so that nobody is personally there. You know, and fictionalizing, making up a person out of nothing, it's a very odd process, but it's not as odd as it seems. You've got so many people in your mind, all the people you've met. It's characteristics you start with. I need somebody who has this characteristic to be part of the story, and then you attach other characteristics to them, and in the end they don't look like anybody, but they feel real because they've got real characteristics. So there's nobody who's personally going to feel exposed by anything in my writing. And I did slip in my parents in a brief way in this book, but they died by then. And anyway, they're so lovingly, nothing could have bothered them about that.
There's a question from Vanessa. Vanessa, I don't know if you want to ask it yourself or if you're happy for me to.
No, I can ask it. I was just interested, Marion, in hearing you talk about the next book. And it's been fascinating hearing you talk about the process of writing a novel or the non fiction books. But this one, do you yet have a view about whether it'll be a novel?
The one about my parents. Yeah, I mean, I couldn't. I've been trying to find out anything I could from people who were alive still, who knew them, their views, little incidents and so on from them. I've just been building up stuff. I've got boxes and boxes of little stories and stuff. But I had no idea what I was going to do with it. I just knew I didn't want them to disappear. And I didn't know whether I would just do it for my family or whether I would write it for other people. But I actually think have learned in the process of my novels and the reception they've had, I have learned that by just simply telling something as honestly as I can, even if it's about a made-up person, sharing some view of life, it connects with people, that I am somehow able to tell stories in a way that connects, and I don't feel there's any reason only to tell the story for my children. The challenge of writing about my parents is that I grew up in white South Africa in a very, very divided society. And anybody of our generation will know that story. Younger people don't always know that story. But the first question anybody wants to know about somebody from such a divided society is, what stand did they take? It's like writing about Germans during the 1930s. What did they do about the rise of Nazism? And if they did nothing, there's a judgment about them. And if they did something, it's a judgment as well. So you can't write about private individuals in a politically charged situation without tackling those very big questions. And I'm not actually setting out to write about that aspect of it. I'm trying to see them as they felt about their lives at that time, trying to understand the balance of how they felt about it. And I realized pretty soon there's no way I can do that in fiction. I'd have to change them. I'd have to make it up. I'd have to give them a role. I'd have to give them a stand. And actually, that's not what I'm trying to do. So I'm going to just write a series of vignettes. And part of them will be simply childhood recollections of them, and others will be bits that I know that, I mean, my mother wrote some of her own recollections of her own childhood. There's recollections other people have of them. So it'll be a mishmash. I have no idea what it'll be, and it might not get finished, but I'm going to have a stab.
That's great. Sean, I think you've got a question.
Yeah, it's been so lovely listening to you, Marion. Thank you so much for coming to talk to us. I was really interested when you were saying, if I heard it correctly, you were saying that if you know someone really well, whether that's a real person or a fictional person, that there's kind of only one way that the story can go. And I was just really struck by that, because I don't know, I suppose that hasn't been my experience. I feel like there's been so many kind of points in life, in my own life and in other people's lives, where it could have gone in really quite different directions.
That's true, but then you do opt. So there's always a parting of the ways. And once you've taken that route, you can't ever become the person you would have been if you'd taken the other route. Once you've taken that, you've decided certain things. You know, if you form a partnership with somebody, a loving partnership with somebody, you can't ever undo that. So you can't ever go back to the state of being a single person who hasn't ever known an intense love relationship. Once you have a child, you never undo that. You never go back to being a childless person. So every decision you make forms you. And in creating fictional characters, you have to make some practical decisions at the beginning. Are they male, female, other? Are they young, middle-aged, old? Are they single or partnered, happily partnered or unhappily partnered? You know, once you've made, you just summarize very quickly for yourself those big decisions in their own lives. And this is where they are at the start of the story. And at that point, that particular person is not going to make a whole lot of choices which are out of character with who they have become. That's sort of what I meant. It's not that there aren't dilemmas when, you know, how can you go this way, but it's just that. So for instance, the one in which it's easiest to explain that process is this one, somewhere more simple, because it's set on these small islands, the Scilly Isles. So I had to decide at the beginning, if I'm going to set a novel there, are there going to be people born on the islands, or are they going to be outsiders who've come in? Are they going to be wanting to stay, or are they temporary visitors? So these big dividing questions. Then, are they male, female, old, whatever? And I ended up with a set of 3 central characters who were each different from each other, who couldn't possibly have made the choices that the other ones made because of those fundamental things. At that point, you know, that's a kind of mechanical sounding thing. I've got a friend who's been writing a novel for about 10 years. And when I told her that, she was appalled. She thought it sounded so clinical and cut and dried. And that's not at all the way her characters evolve. But at that point, I become a historian and a biographer, and I say, okay, if this person at the start of the story is this age in this situation, how did they get there? And I go and I write their biography from birth onwards. And I never use those in the book, but I know them. So that I did that for Uncertain Light as well. I've got files of biographies of all the characters. And once I've done that, then I just put those away. And then I start, the story somewhere. And then I know somebody with that kind of background couldn't possibly have thought that.
Mm. That's fascinating. Thank you so much. I'm
sure not everybody does it that way.
No, of course, everyone does it differently. Thank you.
It sounds like a very good process to me. The Isles of Scilly feature have been a big part of your life, haven't they?
Well, yes, and there's a political reason for that as well. It's my one non-political book, but you can't completely get away from it anyway. The reason that we started going to the Scilly Isles when our children were quite small for a family holiday, and the reason we did was we had arrived as semi-refugees in the country. We'd been living in Zambia, but we were exiles from South Africa, and my husband didn't have a passport because the South Africans refused to renew his passport, because while we were in Zambia, he was supporting the ANC, which was in exile at that time. And then there was a big political crisis in Zambia, and he was detained without trial, and when he was released, he was deported. So where would he go? When you deport somebody, you deport them to your own country, to their own country. If he'd been deported to South Africa, he'd have landed up in prison for life, because at that time it was treason to support the ANC. So while he was in prison, which was a hard time, I was running around trying to find somebody else that would take us. And the obvious place was Britain, because both of us had British-born mothers. But unfortunately, at that time, there was no right to citizenship through your mother, only through your father. So it was a question of, please, 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 can we come? And eventually we were allowed, and he got in on with no travel document on a special arrangement. But we sat here for 10 years while he was going through the process of trying to get asylum, trying to get his papers recognized, trying to apply to be a British citizen. And 10 years afterwards, we had our first holiday outside of Britain. So while we were in those 10 years, he suffered a great deal from the loss of life depression in the middle of winter, which lots of British people suffer from, but people who've grown up with a lot of sun tend to get it more. And so I was looking one year when he was in a depression, I was looking at the map and find which was the southernmost part of Britain that we could possibly go to for a holiday. And I put the pin on these little islands and found out about them. And that's where we went. And we fell in love with them. And so basically we went back every year with our children. It's their kind of idyllic place that, if they had a lot of money, they would be there a lot of the time. It looks like it's a very simple way of life. That's where the title comes from. But the story is about how actually there isn't a place that's simple. You take your complexities with you wherever you go.
So, I mean, just reflecting on that, Marion, your experience of apartheid South Africa, moving through Zambia at that time, and with Kenneth Kaunda, I mean, it was a very turbulent time indeed, and then coming here and thinking back over the situation of refugees and asylum seekers for the last, 50 years. What do you think some of the challenges will be going forward? I mean, it seems very difficult to change the narrative in this country, notwithstanding books like, your publications, or books like The Beekeeper of Aleppo, which can have, significant impacts on people who may not otherwise be thinking about the plight of people fleeing conflict and persecution and war. But what do you see as some of the challenges going forward?
I mean, I think essentially it's caught up with so many things. And I think one of them is consumerism and our very, our way of life, where people are persuaded to think that they'll be happier if they just buy more things and have more things. It's such a false value I think particularly since the 1980s, the huge growth in division between wealth and poverty in the West, where there's no need for the poverty that we've got. And the failure of the development model in much of the third world, where there's still vast, really terrible poverty that people are dealing with. I think in such a divided world in that way, in what people have and what they think makes life happen, it's very hard to enter into the situation other people are facing. And essentially what we require, if we're to move forward on issues to do with refugees, is for ordinary people to be able to enter into the feeling of what it would be like to be in a bad situation. So that's where something like The Beekeeper of Roletto does a fantastic job. By telling a story, it helps people who've never been in that situation think, oh my God, what if I was in that situation? And I think that's what I've come to. I'm very modest about my books, actually. It probably doesn't sound like it when I get a whole hour of your time to talk about them, but I do know they're a very, very small contribution. But to the extent that they are a contribution, it's about evoking empathy. It's about encouraging, it's about allowing people's goodness to be evoked in thinking about other people and thinking, well, what's it like to be somebody else? And to that extent, any child who reads a book and empathizes with the characters in it, a novel or a historical thing, is learning to empathize. And if we're in a very divided world, whether it's going to be divided by wealth and poverty or by politics or by people becoming climate refugees because we've messed up the planet so much, we're all going to be faced with this challenge of, can we give up a little of our comfort to empathize with somebody else and help them? And for me, organizations like yours, like Refugee Action, there's one in my own local area, Wandsworth welcomes refugees, at the height of the Brexit nonsense, when people were almost being given a license to hate immigrants and to be angry about the other, and to say we just want to be ourselves, we don't want to be connected to other people, we don't want to let anybody else in. At the height of that, there were welcomes refugees organizations being formed everywhere, and yours dates from about that time as well, doesn't it? Wasn't it 2016?
Yeah, 5 years ago, yeah.
Sheffield, Wandsworth, just everywhere. And at the height of when the Syrian refugees were desperately getting into boats and then landing up in Greece and then desperately trying to cross borders, there were awful, awful things happening from people who just felt threatened. But there were also hundreds of thousands of people who were rolling up at stations across Europe with food and with blankets. We have this huge capacity for cutting out the other, but we also have, as human beings, we have a huge capacity for going out to meet the other. And basically, it's like a whole society movement has to be constantly encouraged. But I think it's just more people talking to more people and having chances to meet people who are different from them and feel positive about them. And people raising funds for them by running in marathons, and writing stories about them. And it doesn't have to be a story about refugees. It's any story which is seriously human beings reacting to other human beings in a positive way. And religion as well. Religion is the most divisive force of our time. But when you meet people who are truly motivated by the love that underpins their religion, it's the force which actually motivates people to go out to other people. My daughter lives in Hebden Bridge, which seriously suffers from floods every year, and sometimes really devastatingly. So, they're at the front of the climate crisis, actually. There's a whole real reason, climatically bad use of the land, why those valleys flood. But, what happens when they flood? A group of Sikhs from the Sikh temple in Manchester roll up with food, and they set up a stand and they're giving it to everybody there. They don't live in Hebden Bridge. They just see this human need and they're doing it. And, there's there's refugees, there's Muslim groups feeding refugees. It's just like, and when so it's religion has this positive possibility if people take the love seriously. It has a terribly negative possibility if people just see it as our group versus that group, and it's the same for non-religious people.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions that anyone would like to put to Marion? Just looking across the top of my screen. Any hands up? No. Okay.
Well, I'd just like to say one more thing. It comes back to, I'm going to choke up as I say it, please forgive me. It comes back to Harry's question about loss and grief, is that the reason we're meeting tonight is because Anne Barker suggested it. She's been reading my novels for 30 years and I didn't know, basically, but we've been connected without my knowing. So it's a really lovely example of how if you feel something strongly, you write it down, you can, it's like throwing a message in a bottle out to sea, somebody might pick it up, you're connected, you're intimately connected. So thank you, Anne.
Oh, thank you. Yes, thank you, Anne. Thank you, Michael, for putting us in touch with Marion. That's wonderful. And I'd like to thank you, Marion, very much for coming to speak to us this evening, albeit virtually. It's been wonderful to have this opportunity to meet with you and hear more about your life journeys and your writing. That's fantastic. And Harry, thank you so much for leading us through that conversation as well. That's been wonderful. And really thank you to everybody who has come along and listened and participated.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real privilege.
Oh, you're very welcome. And we hope to keep in touch. It's been wonderful.
Thank you.
Yeah, Harry's holding up your book. I'm going to hold up your book as well.
Can I just say, don't wait to see it on the shelves of the bookshop because you probably won't, but any bookshop can order any book for you. You just have to tell them the title and the author.
Yeah. And it really is a wonderful read. And you can dip into it and every chapter has something to make you go, oh, amazing.
Can I also say, for this moment, we're all connected and then you're all going to disappear. I would love to hear from you again if you do read any of my books. You can get my email from the organizers, but you can also always write to an author about their books via the publisher. It's on my website. So I would love to hear from you again. Thank you.
Well,
thank you so much, Marion. It's been lovely meeting you. Really lovely. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay. Have a great evening, everybody. Thank you for your time and for coming along.
Thank you so much.
All right. You take care now. Bye-bye. Have a good evening, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.